Hi, this is Robert Furrow, and welcome to a special edition of Hot Topics. I've been invited onto Joyrides, the ALS Diaries, to talk about my experience with my father who died of Lou Gehrig's disease and with my late wife who died of cancer, and come alongside of Noreen. If you guys have been watching Joyrides at all, then you know that Christine Mariotti and Noreen Wilson. Christine is Noreen's daughter. We've been friends with Noreen for 40 years. Christine as well. She was just a little baby back then. But they're going through some real struggles now, possibly, most likely, an ALS diagnosis. We're still praying that it may be something different or that God may intervene. But we talk in this episode, we talk about what it's like to face difficulties and hardships, and how they correspond with our relationship with Christ, and how we should react and respond as we go through difficulties. So I hope you guys enjoy this one.
What's up, Joyriders? This is Christine Mariotti,
Maureen Wilson,
and we're here with
Robert Furrow.
This is like a Joyrides mashup with Hot Topics with Pastor Robert Furrow. If you haven't had a chance to check out Hot Topics, now's the time. Since you're on YouTube, go over to Hot Topics with Pastor Robert Furrow, and you will be really, really blessed. So this is episode 6, and if you had a chance to watch episode 5 last week, you would see that we had an interview with my brother Keith and my sister Brittany, of course, along with my mom. And we talked about how our only point of reference prior to my mom's ALS diagnosis was Pastor Robert Furrow telling his story from the pulpit about how his own father passed away from ALS. How old were you when that happened?
I was 13 years old.
Yeah, 13 years
1973.
old. Yeah, so we thought this would be a perfect opportunity for you, since you've had kind of that firsthand experience with ALS, for you to kind of share a little bit of your story, your perspective.
Sure.
I mean, you were 13, so
Right.
Young Robert Furrow.
Yeah.
So share with us your experience at that age with your father.
Sure. And first of all, I just want to say I've known Noreen and Christine really for it's going on 40 years. If it's not 40 years, it's really close to 40 years. So Christine and my late wife, Elisa, were really, really close. And seeing you go through this possible diagnosis has been really difficult on me, as well as I'm sure other family and friends. We love you. We think your attitude is absolutely fantastic. And I really believe that the Lord's gonna bless you in the midst of all of this, whatever the outcome is. But yeah, my father passed away from ALS when he was 38 years old. He was diagnosed at 36 years old. I had no idea how young he was, because I was just a kid. My dad was a bit abusive. So during the sickness, he was kind of absent a little bit, but when he came back, it was not really good. And, but I still had that real struggle from a young age about really wanting that father relationship. Even though it wasn't good with my dad, I wanted that father-son relationship, which I was so blessed with to get with when David was born, to have that father-son relationship. But it was the tragedy of going through that with my mom that really brought me to Christ. It was that shortly after that I invited Christ into my life from what I had gone through with it. And I know it's a very rare disease, and as you know, it's a very brutal disease. And we are, as I said, we're praying for you, and we're believing that God can take anything and turn it around for good. And I believe that God will also answer our prayers. And we are praying for healing as well, believing that our God says, lay hands on the sick and they will recover. We've laid hands on you and prayed for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
But do you remember at all seeing your dad go from, somebody that was well to the deterioration so brutal for ALS?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you remember that?
I do. My dad was like 6'1", 220 pounds, a little bit big, and before he died, he was like 95 pounds.
Oh, that's awful.
So he really deteriorated. He had a trach. He also had, the suction machine that was used to be able to, for him. And, it's interesting. My mom was such a trooper, and she went to work right after that. And that was part of me and my sister going a little bit crazy in our teen years, because our teen years we didn't have a lot of supervision. But my dad also worked for the Air Force Base. And so my mom had trouble accepting it that it might have been some kind of contamination that came out of Sandy or Kirtland in Albuquerque. And they did, and the military is good about this, but they did, there was some money that was involved there. And so my mom always kind of had that feeling that maybe it was something else that had caused it. But my own experience with my wife dying is that part of the grief process is looking for anything you go through the anger, you go through the blame, you go through you go through all of that. And part of it is looking for, a scapegoat, somebody who was, who would, was to blame.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what we found out was that it could be environmental. They don't know. It's still to this day, after many years of research, they still don't know what the cause is. But one of the things I have said is that it could potentially be environmental.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he went in 2 years, from the diagnosis, he went to here, and he was in the hospital for the last a couple of months, and would come home periodically.
Wow.
Yeah.
At any point during your dad's illness, did anybody ever sit down with you and say, kids, this is what's going on with your dad?
No.
Interesting.
No, I don't know if it was we're talking the early 70s. Yeah. So I don't know if it was the day that it was in. I was never even really told that he had died. When my mom came in the house, I could tell by the look on her face that he had died. And so then it just became assumed after that point. But I don't ever remember them saying, your dad has died. I think, everybody was there and grieving with everybody else. And
you have two sisters?
I have two sisters. I have a younger sister and an older sister.
Okay, so you're in the middle.
Yes, I'm the middle child.
So how did your sisters process all of this?
Well, at 13 years old, I wasn't really sure. I do know my sister and my dad were closer than me and my dad were, my older sister. And I haven't really talked to her a bunch about it, even till this day. And my younger sister, I think she was just so much younger. She was 7 years younger than me. So she was
young.
4,
Wow. So you've gotten to experience grief in a lot of different ways in your lifetime. And most recently, you lost Lisa, your wife. And how many years were you married?
We were married for 30. And so it was almost, this December will be, I think 8 years ago since she passed away. So my late wife, Lisa, we were involved in ministry and cook along ministering to people. And we ministered to people in the midst of difficulties. And really, quite frankly, we're unprepared for that. So coming out as a youth pastor, I'm 25 years old when we start the church here. Then all of a sudden, there's tragedy. The first tragedy happened within the first few months, and there was a baby that drowned in a bathtub. And it was Mark Martin's sister, I believe, Mark Martin's pastor of another Calvary chapel up in Phoenix. And he came down and did the funeral with me, and we ministered to the family. But those tragedies there were, they started right away, learning to deal with and to come alongside of people and help them to see the eternal picture. You really learned that over a period of time. But so many things happened in those early days. Children lost in car crashes. You guys know the situations that we went through and really dealt with it. But nothing bad for us. For us, things went along. And then all of a sudden, and I took to saying after this whole thing with Lisa, that life turns on a dime.
Oh, yeah.
Because we were cooking along, we're ministering to other people. Nothing bad happens to us, but we're coming alongside of other people. Then all of a sudden, there's a cancer diagnosis. And then there's a stage 4 diagnosis.
Right.
And then there's advanced stage 4. And so she lived for a year and 3 months after the diagnosis in September of 2011.
I remember that.
And then she died in December of 2012. And the last few weeks were pretty brutal. They were tough.
That.
But walking with her through it, and Noreen, you know this well because we're close friends with Lisa, she began to think about other people.
Absolutely. I remember that.
As she got to the end, she wanted to spend time with her kids. When she saw people, she took to saying, "I'll see you around the corner," instead of goodbye.
Love that.
Love because that. She was going to be in the presence of the Lord. Yeah. And what I didn't realize back then was she was grieving the loss of her health as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
and I didn't realize that until I was so busy. Men we're such fixers, right? So I'm gonna roll up my sleeve. I'm gonna take care of this. I'm gonna give you the best care we can. God's gonna heal you, And it took me a long time to come to the realization that God wasn't going to heal her. That this was something God was going to do. He was going to heal her ultimately by taking her to be home with him.
Right.
And she came to that realization before I did, and told me God's going to take me. And I said, no, I don't think that's, I don't think so. Because in my mind, I couldn't imagine God doing anything else than taking a pastor of a church and healing his wife, and what a testimony that would be. But God had other plans,
Right.
And she went through plenty of struggles with it.
Yeah.
She died, I say she died well.
Yeah.
She accepted it well.
100%.
But there were moments.
Yeah.
There were moments when she told me one time, whatever is happening here, this better not be about you.
Oh.
She was like saying, if God's trying to do something in me by making her go through this, she was going to be really upset.
That is so
As long as it was God doing something with her. Of course, I mean, that's just an honest moment, right?
Right.
That's an honest moment from
I
her.
love that.
Yeah.
That's
And-
so hard. I could hear her say that.
And there were very real honest moments like that. Everything wasn't just all good all the time.
Right.
Right.
There were the why questions, there were the difficulties, there was the pain and the suffering.
Uh-huh.
And this is what God takes us through. I mean, life is full of, it's full of these kind of things. And life is full of tragedy as well as it's full of the good, really good things. It's interesting, this weekend I'm teaching from Luke 7, verses 11 through 17, where Jesus enters into the city of Naim, and he's got a bunch of people with him. And so they're all kind of marching into the city, and they're all looking to the future, and they have the Messiah, and they're all excited.
Right.
And then coming out of the city gates is a widow who's burying her only son. And so you've got this progression of people that are in tragedy.
Yep.
They're in the awfulness. They're in the throes of their grief and all that they're doing. And you've got this, that's like life. You've got the tragic, horrible things that happen, and you've got the looking for the future and the Messiah. And when they clashed, when they met in the middle, Jesus touches the coffin, which would make him unclean
That's true.
by the law.
Yeah.
So I'm sure the people carrying the coffin, they were ready to be unclean. They're like, what are you doing? And they stop. And then Jesus reaches down and touches him and says, I say unto you, arise. And so he rises from the dead. And this is such a picture of what the real victory is.
Yep.
That it's not about what's happening here. And yeah, if this is a diagnosis and you go to be with the Lord within a few years, that's so brutal. It's so hard. It's all of it's going to be hard for the kids. It's going to be hard for everyone. But we have hope.
Yep.
That's right.
And we put our trust in God, and we know that he's given us so many passages. The death of his saints is precious in his eyes. I wrote a few of those down today.
Yeah.
Psalms 116:15, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints.
Amen.
God, that it's a welcoming home for him.
Right.
For us, we're grieving because you depart,
Right.
but it's a welcoming home for you
Right.
to open up your eyes and to be in the presence of the Lord. I remember the moment Lisa died. It was a Saturday morning, and I'd gotten up, and something was happening with the tumors in her body, and she was leaning to one side more and more. And I straightened her up a little bit, and I heard her kind of gasp. And I went around and I looked, and she had a shocked look on her face. And she just kind of breathed out that last breath. And I think she had one shorter breath after that, but I tried to get her attention a little bit. But that shocked look, it makes you wonder, what did she see? What was shocked, what was the shock that she saw suddenly, for her seeing Jesus, or, whatever that would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you just figure out the verses, just let me throw them out there.
Yeah.
Romans 14:8, for if we live, we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's.
Amen.
So that's the big picture that God has for us, is that life here is full of good times, full of tragedy. This world will have difficulty, will have trouble. And we can see that. I also think I didn't handle it the best way I could have with Lisa. I don't know with my dad either, but I was pretty young. I'll give myself excuses. But
You mean after the fact, or
no, I think even in her last days, I mean, one of the last things that she ever said to me, we were sitting there and I was watching, I brought a TV into where her hospital bed was, and on the I was watching Gold Rush.
Okay.
So, and she's going in and out of consciousness. I'm helping whenever she needs.
Of course.
And she says, you're letting me die. She clearly says, you're letting me die. And she can barely talk anymore. And at this point, life is just a mess. This is hospice. We're trying to keep her comfortable.
Right.
And I should have said, I would do anything for you,
Of course.
I would do,
Yeah.
that's what I should have said.
Right.
But instead I said, a little frustrated, what do you want me to do? what do you want me to do? I don't know what to do. It's just a human.
That seems real to me, though.
A human response.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're dealing with that, and those are the kind of regrets that you have afterwards when you're going through that grief process.
Right.
They talk about the steps of grief. There used to be 5, then there were 7. What I've learned is they're all different,
Right.
and people go through all kinds of different ones.
Right.
So I went through a huge regret. I went through anger, which was interesting for her. I was angry at her, not for her dying or anything, but for unresolved things, things we didn't resolve years ago.
Ooh, good point.
And it would come back up, and I'm like, why did you do that? And we just didn't talk it out.
Interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. And it tells us, I think, the importance of really resolving things in our marriage, making sure we don't push things underneath, but that we get it out in the open and we talk about it.
Okay, I'm taking notes here.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things when I think about that time that we were talking, she didn't want to talk about it. So I wanted to talk about it. She didn't want to talk about it. All I was looking for was, and I think it would have helped me had she said, I didn't know you felt that way. I'm sorry I made you feel that way.
Right.
That would have been all I need. I didn't need her to go, what you think I was doing was right, or, I just needed to know I was heard.
Right.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, when you start doing counseling, that sounds so much like women, I'm just not heard. But
Right.
hey, we all need it.
Right.
Well, especially in a situation like you don't. Well, I don't know how you were the last week, but I remember seeing her the weeks that passed, saying, I'm having a hard time. Like, I can see God being glorified through a healing, but I couldn't see how God would be glorified through your death. I don't want you to leave. But again, like I just said to Kathy, if there's a different diagnosis for me, Robert, I literally would get up on top of this building, on the rooftop, and shout it. Because I would be excited, but at the same time from the get-go, I think it's bothered people that I haven't been that upset with this diagnosis, because my hope has always been, since I've given my life to the Lord, my hope has always been heaven. So I know that Lisa probably wasn't even coherent, really, because she was on hospice and probably on meds.
Yeah,
but
she was.
I was hurt that my best friend was leaving me.
Yeah.
And I remember saying to her, I don't understand. I didn't understand.
Right.
And I think she wanted to stay. She had a new grandson.
No, she wanted to stay. She wanted to stay. Yeah.
And so.
Yeah. Evan was only 2 months old
I remember that.
when she died.
Right.
She wanted to go, the time she was still mobile, she wanted to go hold him. That's what she wanted to do.
remember that.
So, Robert, we know that there are so many people that are hurting, that are possibly even going through a time of grieving themselves, whether it's the loss of a loved one, family member, friend. What encouragement could you give to someone that's walking through a period of grief right now?
Yeah, and I think if you're on that diagnosis end, if you've gotten the diagnosis, it's a bad diagnosis. Couple of things I think. Jesus chose Peter, James, and John as his inner circle. And James and John were brothers. He called them, nicknamed the Sons of Thunder. James was the older. John was youngest. He was youngest of all the disciples. John was maybe in his teens still, maybe even 19 years old, if 20 barely. And they were both in leadership. He brought them in for leadership, and you would think that he would use them both throughout their lifetime to be used in that way, but God had a different plan for each one of them. Yep. And James is the first apostle to be martyred. He's killed by Herod with the sword. And that's the night Peter's arrested and is set free by an angel. And you go, well, why does God rescue Peter but not James? Right. And why would God use James as the inner circle during his ministry and let him die within a handful of years after the death of Jesus? And then John, on the other hand, the other brother, lives to be longer than any of the other disciples. So they bracket the apostles in their life, and God is glorified through the death of James, and God is glorified through the life and death of John as well. Yeah. And I think it's important for us just to realize that Jesus came and suffered as an example of how suffering could be used to do such a great work. Salvation of anyone who would receive him. Mm-hmm. And then Paul said that we would know him in the fellowship of his suffering, and that we somehow complete the sufferings of Christ. He said that I complete the sufferings of Christ in my body, and that God uses it to bring people to Christ. I often say, when life is going good and we're living for Jesus, that's one thing. People see us and they see the example that we're living. But when we're suffering the loss, a great severe loss, people look at us even closer.
Yeah.
And it's in the darkness that we shine the brightest. And out of, I think there's been a lot of ministry out of me going through my dad dying of ALS when I was young. There's been a lot of ministry coming out of my wife, me going to be with the Lord, and a lot that God's done in my life with it as well. So that whatever the suffering that you're going through, you don't have to like it. We shouldn't like it, right? I mean, I hated that Lisa got cancer. I hate that you might have this, bulbar ALS. But I trust God. And I believe that God can use it for his glory. And if God is going to ask me, my current wife, who's here, Kathy's here, to suffer, then we're willing to say whatever our lives are yours.
Amen.
And if the Lord tarries, we're all going to suffer. We're all going to die of something.
Yeah.
Something's going to happen. And I think when you look at James and John and you think, well, which one got the best part? Was it John who got to live all that time? Eventually was boiled in oil and exiled to the island of Patmos?
Right.
Or James that was in the presence of the Lord?
Right.
And there's also Hebrews chapter 11, and I don't have time to develop it a lot, but you've got all these great miracles that are happening in the beginning of Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith. And all of these, and he gets into this list where he starts rattling it off. It's almost like he's run out of time now. Women received their dead back to life, and he just starts giving these lists of these great things that happen. And then he goes, but others were, deserted, lived in caves, sawn in half. And he gives all of these others that faced all these difficulties. Yeah. And then it says down, men of whom the world was not worthy. So they who suffered were in a place where the world wasn't worthy of them for those that did great things. He puts those that suffered in a greater light than he puts for those that did great things by faith. And so people today will say, well, hard times come upon people, or you're going through a hard time because a lack of faith, or the faith movement, the whole false teachings of the faith movement.
Or
sin in your life.
Yeah.
No, I certainly got that. I had people tell me that, that I'm, as the man of the house, that my wife died of cancer, says a lot about me. I've had, people can say really mean things, which is another thing. People say nice things. We shouldn't point at people either, but we will.
I know.
But, sometimes, and it says that they did not receive the promises, but saw them from afar.
Right.
So sometimes there's the promise that, yes, we're going to live forever, but we may go through suffering here and see them from afar. And whatever that lot is, then we'll take it. And life is, as soon as you start to breathe, there's going to be something that's going to take your life. Unless we're lucky enough to be in the presence of God. So God might as well get glorified out of everything.
Amen.
I like that.
Yeah.
So as you know, our series is titled Joy Rides.
Yes.
The ALS Diaries. Like, how could we possibly even combine joy with ALS, right?
Right.
But the idea is that life is just this ride. We don't know what's coming around the corner, but regardless of whatever comes our way, we're going to choose to have joy, because our joy comes from the Lord. We've often talked about, how does anybody that doesn't know the Lord go through these difficult circumstances without having that peace, that the peace that surpasses all understanding. It's amazing to me. And it makes me so grateful that the Lord is with us, and that our hope and our joy is in him, and in the midst of all circumstances. Yeah, me too. And I can't imagine that either. And if you are listening to this and you're in the middle of difficulty and hardship, and you haven't come to Christ, then receive him as your Savior. He came and suffered to make a provision for your sin, and all you have to do is say, I want him in my life. Go and find a Bible-believing church and begin to live for him. Amen. When you tell him, I want you in my life, he's going to start doing a work in your life, and he's going to bring you to those places that you need to be. But I can't imagine it either, because it's difficult no matter what. It's difficult whether you're with, whether you know the Lord or not, but to not know him, to be suffering for no reason. Right.
That we have a reason for our suffering is very powerful.
Yeah. Well, Robert, we want to thank you so much for being on Joy Rides, this really cool mashup of Joy Rides and Hot Topics.
Yep.
So as always, we would love for you to like, comment, subscribe, and even share. Let's do a challenge. Let's see, tag as many people as possible that you know would be blessed by this particular episode of both Joyrides and Hot Topics. And if you have any questions, maybe some helpful insight of things that you think would be helpful for us to know, comment. Put them in the comment section. We do read them. We're thankful for them. It's important for us to connect with you. So we want to hear what you have to say.